evaluation before every board meeting. Did I hear that right?
Not an
At 6
evaluation,
o'clock,
but-
that process.
For the discussion, yeah.
That discussion. Would it make sense to start the board?
Sorry. It says it's on off, but what do I know on technology?
Give me a second. I thought my wife was here. That's her agreement. A thought. Start the regular meeting at 6 o'clock. Do your first few things. But then have a standing agenda item, like maybe 4 point, I'm making this up as I go, but maybe part of 5, new business or old business, make it 4 something. So do the first part of the meeting. And then at 10 after 6 or 4 after 6, then do the discussion of the
I
evaluation.
think we were concerned that some of our conversations during board self-evaluation may be executive,
Got it.
because of things we would be discussing. So,
I
so that first meeting
could.
is not necessarily public. That 6 to 6:30 meeting will not necessarily be public. Am I
I mean,
right?
sometimes it might be, but it might not always be.
So you have to let me know.
Yeah. 'cause
Right,
you can't
right.
quite
I'm
anticipate
going to be able to
it.
go back in and read the meeting.
Right, we'd have to go back.
Right. We need, this is what we need to work out. This is what
Yeah.
and I think that's what that subcommittee in June was, to figure out what we really need to do.
You could probably start your executive meeting at 5:30, go into general meeting at 6.
Or have it open, if it's open. If
That's-
you need it, exact, do it at the end.
Yeah, you can do it at the end.
I think just making sure that it's part of the
Yeah,
monthly
I
meetings
agree.
is.
Yeah, however it
is
has to
most
happen.
important.
Agree.
And we can figure out those pieces of the details as we go. All right, so Ellen,
Yeah.
School climate
Thank
workshop?
you for listening.
So, NISBA sends us constant messages about workshops and things like that. And one of the ones that came through was it was a policy workshop about school climate. And knowing that this was part of ESSA and part of what was going on, I chose to go. And it was again, everything I've ever done with NISBA has been very interesting and very educational, and absolutely great. There were really 3 talks at this. The first one was entitled Securing Positive School Culture. They talked about the New York State Safe Schools Task Force that was put into place, I believe, after Sandy Hook. And they had 3 different task forces, one working on school climate and student engagement, one working on data use and reporting, and one working on building infrastructure and security. They said, they came out with 36 recommendations, and I don't have them, and I'm not going to torture everybody with that. But there were 2 themes. One was focused on social-emotional learning, which they defined as understanding and managing emotions, establishing and maintaining positive relationships. And the other was promoting and measuring school climate, and instead of focusing and measuring school violence, focusing on the opposite. They're working with some pilot schools, which I do not believe we are involved in, that we're actually looking for schools to build school climate mission statements and community engagement teams, administering surveys, which this is exactly the kind of survey that they're talking about, actually. Generating reports, summarizing data, and then creating action plans. Right now, those pilots are voluntary. The sense I got is that moving down the road, that is going to be part of the expectation of the ESSA plan for all of that. But for me, so that was the background about why all of this is relevant at the moment for us. For me, the education about talking about social emotional learning was great. The one slide they put up that I found very sort of meaningful, and I've talked about a lot, was a slide that says, if a child doesn't know how to read, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to multiply, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to drive, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to behave, we punish. And why can't we finish the last sentence as well, automatically as we do the others? And so it's this instructional approach to discipline with clear, developmentally appropriate, and proportional consequences to behavior. So it's not no consequences, it's, and removing students from the classroom only as the last resort. And again, for me, this tied into the discussions we started having about safety and pushing out versus pushing in, or pulling them in, and all of that sort of stuff. And even when students are removed from the classroom, getting them back in as soon as possible. And the term they use is restorative practices, which is a shift in looking at, traditionally you talk about school rules being broken. With the restorative approach, you're talking about people and relationships being harmed. Traditionally, justice focuses on establishing guilt. With the restorative, justice identifies needs and responsibility. Traditional accountability equals punishment. Restorative accountability equals understanding impact and repairing harm. Traditional justice directed at the offender, the victim is ignored. Restorative, offender, victim, and school all have direct roles in the justice process. Traditional rules and intent outweigh whether outcome is positive or negative. With the restorative, the offender is responsible for harmful behavior, repairing harm, and working towards positive outcomes. And then the last one that they list out is, with the traditional approach, limited opportunity for expressing remorse and making amends. In the restorative approach, opportunity is provided to make amends and express remorse. And again, so it's a real it's a significant paradigm shift, I think, for a lot of people and the mindset of how things go. But I thought it was for me, it was very interesting in the context of all the conversations we've been having about safety and all of that. They talked about childhood adverse experiences, which again is something that comes up in my world and is being more and more understood. And again, I don't know what other people's knowledge or experiences of understanding adverse childhood experiences, but what they're talking about, so the 10 that they list are children who have experienced verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, divorce or separation, physical abuse of a parent, alcohol or drug abuse of a parent, mental illness of a parent, or incarceration of a parent. And what they talked about is that children with multiple adverse childhood events actually become socially, emotionally stuck, which I think is something that we all see and sort of have a sense of, but I had never actually heard it presented quite that way. And then that becomes a driver for a lot of their emotional dysregulation, because if you're stuck at 3, you don't have a whole lot of tools to work with. And so understanding that and then working with that. The second lecture was entitled Trauma-Sensitive Schools, and that was a superintendent and principal from Schenectady who have been working at being a trauma-sensitive school for 4 years now. Bill, so it's the superintendent that you've met, is that? And so he was one of the speakers. Absolutely incredible speaker, absolutely incredible. I can't imagine, again, we're spoiled, but I live here for a reason. Like, I chose to live here for a reason, and to hear not only what everyday life is like for so many of the families in that school district, but what life in school is like in that district. It is really just sort of startling and shocking and eye-opening, and gives me a whole new appreciation for what we do have. So one of the things he talked about is that what's the role of the Board of Education in all of this, and it's making sure that if the district chooses this as a priority, making sure that the work can happen. Because it's not easy and it's highly political. He said, rest assured that if you start changing how you manage these things, you're going to have parents and teachers standing up at these meetings, pounding on the doors and pounding on the tables. And so you have to be ready and be confident and comfortable and knowledgeable in what you're doing so that you know that what you're doing is the right thing for kids. He talked about how stressors lead to fight or flight or freeze, which again is not a presentation I had ever seen before. And so then he, said, okay, what does freeze look like? And so we, broke down in small groups and talked about what does freeze look like. And freeze is the kid with his hood up and his head down, who's not making eye contact and not responding, which looks a whole lot like defiant. And so, just sort of changing the perspective on how you see that. Suspension, again, these are just quick notes. Suspension is ineffective for the child or for the school culture. Doesn't help either one. And again, his point was this is all free. All of this is free. It just takes time and effort and that sort of stuff. It does provide accountability and consequences for behavior. They did all sorts of things, and one of the things, again, that I thought was just absolutely incredible was he said they'd spent years and a lot of money on bringing in more social workers and trying to do all these things to get parents involved and doing all these things. And what they finally ended up doing was, through civil service jobs, they started employing parents from out in each of these neighborhoods. So they actually employ parents from these neighborhoods, and when they're struggling with a child and with a family, they take a parent from that parent from that neighborhood goes to that family and sits with them and says, look, this is what's going on. I will go with you. I will come with you. I will help fight with you. We're all on the same side. And with that, they have pulled more parents in dramatically, which again, I just thought was incredible and a great sort of out of the box. That there are other things they're doing that we don't even need to think about because it's just not even in our sort of culture, thankfully. But the things he talked about that I just thought were absolutely incredible, again, much bigger school district. I think it's 9,000 to 10,000 students. I think it's just shy of 10,000 students. But they started 4 years ago, and number of days kids are suspended. They started with 15,000 suspension days, out of school suspension days a year, and they have dropped it to 2,500. They've cut their student psychiatric hospitalizations in half by changing so again, to me, those were the numbers that really stood out by working with these restorative practices. And some of it's simple things, like when kids are fighting in the hallway and the teacher is going in to break up a fight in a bigger school where not everybody knows each other. They taught the teachers to go in and just put their hand out and say, hi, I'm Mr. So-and-so, or I'm Miss So-and-so. And, what's going on? Instead of walking up to the kid and saying, what's your name? Because the immediate response from the child then is to push back, where if the adult introduces themselves, it kind of de-escalated the whole thing. Anyway, the mind shift of, instead of looking at the kid and saying, what's the matter with you, looking at the kid and saying, what has happened to you? And that sort of thing. So again, I could go on and on and on all day about all that, because I would love to invest a lot of time and energy in that. So that's something I would like to bring up as something for the district to discuss. The third lecture was actually all about policies and which policies are specifically addressed to that. And they actually have, NISBA now has a code of conduct policy, which we just revised ours, that is written with restorative justice language. That I don't think it's readily accessible, but if we want it, we can ask for it, and I can just email the woman who gave the talk. So if and when it comes time to start thinking that way, they've already done all that legwork. I think the other thing that stood out for me with all of these policies, and I don't know, I think this is, our policy numbers don't match NISBA policy numbers. So, she's talking about policy this, and when I look it up, those aren't our numbers. So I don't know whether that's good, bad, indifferent, whether that's something.
Two systems.
Yeah,
Two different systems.
and do we want to, we've been.
NISBA has its own policy service, so does our BOCES. Erie BOCES has a policy service.
So ours is BOCES.
Our district has done the MO BOCES policy service.
Okay, and then the BOCES helps us with
NISBA back in the day used to have a lettering system.
Yeah, but it was so there's this there's literally like a 2-page list of policies that impact school culture, and I'm like, trying to bring them and mesh them with ours is a little bit
different numbering system.
It's a little bit cumbersome, but it's not impossible. So there's a whole list of all of the policies that they talk about that can. So for me, again, this is right up my alley. This is all. And in a situation where budget is a significant issue, that safety is a concern. For me, what I walked away with this is that this is an approach to not only improving school safety, but improving, student achievement and school culture and decreasing absenteeism and so many of those pieces, and it's free. And so I just wanted to.
What's that policy services?
No, but restorative practices, it's sort of changing the way we look at things and address things. And they did have, so there are trainings this summer, professional development on social emotional learning, there's a restorative practices workshop, where they actually want school teams of up to 4 people, and you leave with a plan. And they only want schools that are really interested in actually changing that. Tom Cavanaugh from the University of Denver, who the Schenectady folks identified as sort of the guru of the trauma-sensitive training, is doing 3 trainings this summer that NISBA is supporting, and I think will be free. So again, if as a district we're interested in learning more, doing more, those sorts of things, there's free training available and some pretty significant stuff available.
Ellen, who's the name again, Tom?
Tom Cavanaugh. Yes. So I know that was fast and rambling, but again, it's one of those things that kind of energized me and I found struck a chord with me and how I like to sort of look at life and approach things, so. That's it.
Thank you for sharing. Very informational. We have community participation. If anybody would like to come forward, please remember the 3-minute time frame and come to the microphone. With that, do we have
No, there'll be no action after executive session.
So with that, we're going to, I need a motion to adjourn to executive session where we will discuss the employment history of particular individuals and pending and current litigation.
Second.
Discussion?
I would like to ask Bill and Harry to join us.
Okay.
Can we adjourn to the superintendent's office? Do you want to do that?
So thank you all for being here and can I have a vote tonight? All in favor?
Yeah.
Hey, guys.